If you're joining us today um, for your first time, welcome. If you're an old timer, welcome back. I'm going to ask everybody to drop into the chat and let's write in there something that you are curious about, something that you're curious about and would like to explore. So this is kind of fun today. This is my dad's deer stalker hat, and it doesn't fit me at all. I guess he had a smaller head than I did. Tried to find a cool overcoat and couldn't find mine, so I can't fit my arms through it because this is my wife's. But together, don't I look like somebody who's going to be doing some investigation today? So it's going to be fun. We're going to be unpacking today how to play with mysteries, and it's going to be fun. Ah, so yeah, drop into the chat anything that you are curious about, things that currently have you kind of puzzling and going, um, and share that. And what we're going to be um, playing with today is part two of our kind of questioning, our questioning investigation. We're going to be looking at how do you find yourself, once you find yourself in the middle of a mystery, how do we kind of go about exploring that? And having some really intentional strategies that we can look at and having some structure to that, I think really, really helps us just go spelunking down these rabbit holes. Well, I'm delighted to be here with all of you. Fun to see some of these questions that are coming in from folks. And I think that being intentional with asking questions and sort of being in the middle of something that you don't really understand and are geeking out on, I think is a useful thing. So if somebody asks you, like, what are you curious about? Like we usually say, we ask when we meet people, we want to, like, so what do you do? But isn't it an more interesting question to find out what are you currently curious about? And I think our lives become richer when there is some little mystery that we have percolating in the background, and we're like I'm really having fun geeking out on this right now, and I want to invite you to do the same. So let's start with just a quick review of what we did last week and then go into part two. So last week we were looking at how do we start to ask richer and more interesting questions. And today we're going to be building on that with what do you do when you get them. So I am going to share a screen here. There we are. And so curiosity is this wonderful phenomenon that happens inside our brain. And when you get curious, your brain gets a slosh of the neurotransmitter dopamine. It makes playing with whatever you're doing a lot more fun. And the last time we met, we talked about sort of three sort of sets of scaffolding, which I write into my journals and I use to help prompt me to ask richer questions. We explored the who, what, where, when, how, and why. That's the kind of questioning strategies that I think we often learn first in school. We took a look at the questioning strategies that were used by international schools, and that also had interesting things such as perspective and reflection added into it. Perspective being, what are some different points of view about this topic, and reflection being, how is this relevant? How do I connect to it? What is my responsibility here? And really powerful questions. We also took a look at the cross-cutting concepts from the next generation science standards. These are things that from the American Academy of, of, of Sciences has, the National Academy of Sciences has figured out. These are kind of big picture questions that scientists often grapple with, and we looked at how those can be useful for asking richer questions. And again, my strategy with these is to, if I try to get my brain to, on a regular basis, to think in a different way. And so if there's an idea that I haven't grappled with or struggled with in a while, I will try to bring it up and play with it. So if I haven't, for instance, if I look at this list and say like, change, that's interesting. I haven't really thought about change in a while. Then I'm going to go out into my garden and I might even write change on the page. I might even do it in a little sort of word picture. And then with this idea of change in my mind, what I see as I am going around, what I notice, will be different than what I otherwise would have seen. Just because I've got this different lens of change in front of my eye. I will see the world through differently colored glasses, and I will ask different sorts of questions. And that, for its own sake, is useful and interesting. But now, you've got a question. Oh, we also talked a little bit about the question behind the question. That is, when you're asking your questions, just first start with whatever questions come easily, write them down, and very often those questions will then help you dig a little bit deeper for a more interesting, more nuanced question, what we call the question behind the question. And those we often, those are waiting for us if we are willing just to do a little bit of spelunking. And now we have these questions in our head. We've got them written down in our nature journals. The question that is often asked is, do you have to answer all of these questions? And the answer is no. Ideally, you are asking many more questions than you could ever answer in a lifetime. And these questions are useful in that they get our brains to kind of engage with things more, to kind of stick with a phenomenon, to look a little bit harder, and sometimes to help us get the question behind the question. So that's even if we don't go about trying to answer them. They do all those things for us. So the questions are valuable actually just on their own. Sometimes we'll answer them and sometimes we won't. There's basically not enough hours in the day to answer all the questions. But sometimes you'll be out there and there'll be a question that kind of bubbles to the surface that is really gets you hooked. And these are really fun things to play with and explore. The most natural thing that people tend to do these days is pull out their phone and Google it. And this is okay. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with doing that. But if that's what you're always doing, you're missing out on not just a lot of fun, you're missing out on the opportunity of your brain to practice how do we figure things out? How do we assess evidence for a different claim on our own? And how do we go about doing that? And if we assume that the answers are there on Google, then what we'll tend to do is we'll kind of put our question into Google. You'll find an answer that's kind of like what you were asking, or sometimes exactly what you're asking, and we'll be satisfied with that. But then we tend not to go that much deeper. If, on the other hand, you are in the practice of how to kind of drill into a question, you're going to find that these questions, they start to unfold and pull you on an adventure. Doing your own investigation of things is really, really fun. Both because you start to figure stuff out, but you're also embedded in the process of figuring things out. Many years ago, we had this idea that, there were tinkerers, there were inventors, people in their garages were figuring stuff out and having fun with it. There's a general idea in the community that by messing about with stuff and paying attention and then being in discussion with other people, we could figure out a lot of things. Now we assume that somebody else has already done the figuring for us, and we go to Google. So sometimes I will Google things. Other times I want to try to explore it myself. And very often when I go to Google, I'm wondering if I can use it as a tool to help me find the even richer question behind the one that I'm looking at. Let's take a look at the structure of questions. Or actually, first let's just play with, well, I wanted to just play with questions themselves. We're going to just do a little bit of question practice. And what I have here is an animation that was created by NASA. And this is the year 2006. And what it is it is from sensors that are placed all around the globe and in orbit. They made a model of atmospheric carbon dioxide and carbon monoxide worldwide. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to show this to you, and your goal is to first look at it and just be looking for patterns. Look for patterns. Say to yourself, what's the pattern here? Is there a pattern here? What's the pattern here? What's going on? And to start to try to ask questions. Again, we have all of these kind of prompts. And what you're going to try to do is to try to come up with as many questions as you can. And as you do, I'm going to ask you to write them down. Write down your questions as you watch. And we're going to give this a try. So in black and white, there is atmospheric carbon, and the color swirls, atmospheric carbon monoxide, and carbon dioxide is the color swirls. So those, you can see that there are little kind of bars on the bottom. Are you ready? Let's ask questions, and we're going to write them down. there's any other questions that are stuck in your head. Isn't that interesting? So we're actually not going to be answering those questions right now. The purpose of this was to put a phenomenon in front of you and to ask questions. And the more that we can ask, the more our brain engages. So let's count up your questions right now. And I'm going to invite you to drop into the chat. How many? Oh, then we feel competitive. Let's not share how many we have. We don't need to do that. So this idea of having a phenomenon before you, noticing and then finding a question related to that, noticing and finding a question related to that, it's a skill that we can get better and better and better at. And the more curious we are, if you have now a sort of a sense of a desire to want to follow up on a question that you have, right? That's a lot of what we're going for here. We want our brains to be hungry for discovery. And the way we whet our appetite for that is through this intentional curiosity. So here, even if you weren't feeling curious before that, perhaps you are feeling curious now because we intentionally did curiosity. So when you have a question, what are you going to do about it? Well, I'm going to propose a 3-part system to give us ideas about what we can do when we get a question. And the first strategy is what I call the let's see approach. And you have a phenomenon in front of you, you've got a question, and very often these are, what and where and when and how questions. Many times, these are questions that we can answer through our own direct observations. And so what we do, if we're wondering when robins start to migrate, we go, when do robins start to migrate? Well, what I can do is I can go out and I can start looking at robins. Right? I also can call up friends across the globe and have them start looking at robins, get a larger data set. Turns out there are bird watchers all over the world who are watching robins and reporting their stuff into eBird. So I could go on and use that as a tool. But you see, all these involve various aspects of directly looking at something. And in some cases, I might need some special tools for that. If I'm wondering about positions of Jupiter's moons, well, then I definitely need a telescope or some other tool. So sometimes in order to do this let's see approach, you may not have all the right tools on hand, but you get those tools in your hand. If you're wondering something about bat vocalizations, you might need something that detects bat vocalizations because our ears can't do it. But essentially what we're doing by going on eBird and looking at everybody's entries is we are putting our own eyes everywhere simultaneously, and but still, it's basically we're making observations. And this is a really useful way of figuring stuff out. If I or another scientist wants to find out where do bears sleep at night? What you do to answer this is you go out, you watch a lot of bears. Now, as you're doing this, there's a couple of things you want to think about. One is how big is your sample size? Right? So as you're watching your bears, how many bears have you looked at? Well, you've watched one bear? Well, good for you. All right, let's get a bigger sample size than that. Let's watch more bears. And then the next piece is so in addition to sample size is, are you collecting data in a way that might introduce bias into your results? So for instance, oh, sorry, I thought I turned you off. Telephone. Oh no, I didn't. There we go. Now we've got that phone silenced. Ha! Right? So in addition to your sample size, how big is your sample? And kind of the fun way that scientists talk about this is they say, what is the size of your N? So N is your sample size, the letter N. And so if you have an N of 1, this is a small sample, right? So we want to avoid the N of 1. And the other thing we want to think about is this idea of bias. So if I only go out to watch where bears sleep at night when the weather is pleasant, because that's the most comfortable time to go out and watch bears, I may not get an accurate picture of where bears sleep at night because I only go out when the weather is good. What about when it's raining? What about when it's snowing? What about when it's really freezing outside and I don't want to go out and watch bears? That might be one of the times that's most interesting to watch bears sleep at night. But so as I want to look at my data and say, is there a potential here for bias? And then I am going to draw conclusions from those observations. All right, so I am going to, from that, I'm going to induce from these general observations or these specific observations, a generalized claim about this is where bears sleep at night. But that's my own direct observations. This is how most of what we refer to as natural history, the information in these books we have about what animals do, it comes from someone just like you going out and watching bears, and also going out and watching bears when the weather is rough. But sometimes we cannot directly make observations to answer our questions. So if I'm wondering when robins migrate, we can directly observe that, and we can write it down. We can have a chart where we keep track of this, and we can get more observations, get a really big N. We can make sure we're exploring in all sorts of different habitats. We're exploring in all sorts of different weather. And we can figure that out from our observations. But if I'm trying to ask, why do robins migrate at that time? Things get more interesting, and things get a little bit more difficult. So this first category of the let's see questions, it's how you answer this is very direct, but not so with this second category. And this is where what we call our could it be questions come in. So I'm wondering why they do this. And the way I do this is initially I try to come up with as many possible explanations as I can. So these explanations, here are several different explanations of why robins migrate. And I'm going to ask you now to drop into the chat a few more, right? So maybe they see the leaves turning color, and that sends a little signal to the bird brain going, time to move, and they move, right? Maybe they're kind of calculating that the days are getting shorter. Maybe they're figuring out, uh, yeah, it's hard for me to get food. I better go to a place with better food. It's getting too chilly. All right, those are a few possibilities. Let's drop a few more into the chat. See if anyone can come up with some. Ah, the idea of stories shared through the robin community. You're finding this out from other robins that it is time to move, right? Ah, right. Parents and grandparents did it. There's some sort of social thing kind of going on. Like, it's always been done this way. I guess we better do it. Oh, maybe it's something with their molting. All right. When they kind of get to a certain stage in their molting, they're going to go. Mm, mm. So the amount of daylight hours, or maybe it's something about the angle of the sun. See, this is good. This is good. Now, what we want to do is it could be any of these things. Ooh, Vea says maybe they're predators that are coming in. Maybe as the season kind of gets on, there's an influx of predators, and now this area is just lousy with Cooper's hawks. It's time to get away from the Cooper's hawks. So, um, I'm. It could be what we want to do is notice that, like, I would not have come up with a bunch of these other ones. I came up with specifically the ones that I did, and there are always going to be possible explanations that you didn't think of. And we want to be really aware of the possibility of explanations other than the ones which we came up with our little monkey brain, right? So it could be these, it could be the ones we put into the chat, or it could be something else that we haven't thought of yet. And this is really important. This idea that the explanation for it could be one of these things, or it could be something else that I haven't thought of yet, is critical to how we do this. And Vea is pointing out in the chat that this is what we call a Yweb. So what I do in my journal is I have my question. I then start drawing lines out from it with, on each of those, I put a possible explanation, a possible explanation, a possible explanation. When I realize I have a could it be question in front of me, my goal is to get as many possible plausible explanations as I can. And if I only come up with one, I'm in a really dangerous situation, because that one that I have thought of will start to feel like the answer, and it might not be. But just because it came to me first, my brain is going to go like, oh yeah, it's probably that. So for a lot of people, we stop thinking about things when the first probable, plausible explanation comes to our head. Or we ask somebody and somebody says, well, blah, blah, blah. And you go like, oh, blah, 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 right? That first idea gets special power and special place in our brain, but it might not be right. That's why we want to always intentionally get at least two possible explanations going in on our Yweb. So one to one explanation, one to another explanation, and then we add in a third branch that's going to go off and point to a question mark. And what does that stand for? That's right. That is the or something else that I haven't thought of yet possibility in there. Or you could just draw a little line and not have anything attached to it. You want to include the possibility of something else in your visual notes. Your notes on your paper as you're doing this are your thinking process made visible. So you want to make it visible that you're leaving that possibility out there of, or it could be something else. Again, the journal is your brain on paper. We think best when we get our ideas out of our head and onto another piece of paper. And so the more complete we can have that thinking process on our paper, the better off we are. That's why on our Yweb, we always want to have a little line going off just to nothing or going off to a little question mark. So now you've come up with some possible plausible explanations. All right, let's take a look at those a little bit more carefully, because you're going to find that not all explanations really fit into there's a couple of major categories, and it's actually more of a continuum between 2 points. And these are the idea of proximate versus more ultimate explanations, right? Why on most why questions, why did these birds migrate? I can think of an explanation like, oh, they noticed a change in the leaves, and that signaled them to go. They got to a certain point in their molt, and that signaled them to go. When we're asking those sorts of questions, coming up with those sort of things, we're thinking about, like, what is the signal that motivated them, like, oh, it's time to leave, right? That question about what is the signal or the immediate cue that they used to take a hike is different than why really are they going that time? Why are they really going? Is it because the food's about to run out here? Is it because the food has run out there, right? If the food is looking like it's going to run out and then you go, then you're using that food running out as your signal, but it's also kind of gets us, it's much more close to sort of an ultimate cause, right? A more ultimate is like, why is the food running out? Well, we eat these worms, the ground's frozen, right? It has, and I can't get my worms anymore. You know, it's as solid as a rock down there, and the worms aren't coming up. The worms are like, we are going to sleep through this cold winter, and they're not moving around. I can't hear them, can't see them. They're not coming up doing their worm pooping thing. I can't get my worms. So we can think about this why question in terms of more proximate and more ultimate, and they're different questions, and they're both useful and important to think about. But it's useful for us to, when somebody asks why, right, we can think of an explanation of, like, you know, I got out of bed this morning. Why did I get out of bed? Well, the alarm went off, right? And I had to turn off the alarm. So that is a very proximate explanation of why I got up this morning. But if I go layers underneath that, well, I got up this morning because this day ahead of me is filled with opportunity, and I wanted to kind of get to that. Or maybe my reason is that I needed to get my kids to school on time, right? And then you can say, like, well, more ultimately, like that maybe I got up this morning because I think education is important, right? Maybe I got up this morning because I feel that that the happiness of these 2 little girls will be related to how much they feel that. You see how I'm kind of going more ultimate with these ideas? So you can think of these could it be's in terms of this proximate ultimate slider, and give your different points along that. They're all fun to play with. Now, let's unpack this a little bit more, because let's say you have your Yweb, and there's a question, whether it's proximate or ultimate, that is interesting to you. How do we go about unpacking these different, trying to answer some of these questions? Remember before with the let's see, we just started observing. When do they show up? We got out our calendar and we got out our watch and we started watching the robins and sort of seeing when they showed up or when they left. Okay, we can't do that here. So what are we going to do? We know it's a why question, so first step, I mean a could it be question. So our first step, by the way, all why questions are could it be questions. The other categories of questions, like you think about a when question, that could be a let's see, and it also could be a could it be. And the reason for that is, let's say I'm looking at when do, or let's say, let's go for where do bears sleep, right? I can look at that and observe it. If I am asking, where did fossil South American ground sloths sleep? I can no longer directly observe that. But I can study excavation sites of their burrows. And but here, because I'm not directly observing, I can I'm into could it be land. So that's a when question, but because I am no longer, because I don't have my way back machine, I can't go directly observe it, so I have to use this could it be approach. So let's unpack the could it be approach, because it's a little bit more difficult, but it's really, really fun. So what you do when you got your could it be is first you come up with your possible explanations. Also, you can call these hypotheses. And then what do you do? Well, I'm glad you asked. Each one of these, I'm going to try to make a prediction off of that explanation. So what I'm doing when I'm saying making a prediction, the way I phrase this is, if this explanation is true, I would expect to see X. So if this explanation is true, what would I expect to see? Those are my predictions. And I want to write those out. And when I write them out, I can start to kind of look at them, and I can see some interesting patterns in those explanations. For instance, this leaves turning color cue for why my robins are migrating. One of my explanations there is that robins in the north migrate earlier than ones living further south. That's because the leaf color change tends to happen further north and then ripples south. But this same prediction I can actually make about all of these different hypotheses. And that means that, oops, you weren't supposed to come up yet, but you did. Ha! So let's talk about assumptions. We'll come back to that other thing in just a moment. All right, assumptions. You know what they say about assumptions. Assumptions are not bad things, however. Assumptions, what gets us into trouble is when we are not aware of our assumptions. So the hidden assumption is the one that comes out and bites us. The one which we took for granted without even realizing, without even articulating that we took this for granted. We just assumed it. Those are the assumptions that are going to get us into trouble. But around every prediction, there is a cloud of assumptions. Every prediction that you make has assumptions that go along with it. So for instance, why do robins migrate? Well, it becomes difficult to find food. So my prediction is that robins will migrate early if worms and berries are hard to find. What are assumptions that I am making there? What are assumptions I'm making in this statement? Robins will migrate early if worms and berries are hard to find. Let's drop those into the chat. Don't hit send yet. I'm going to ask everybody just to, into the chat, write what are some assumptions that I'm making here when I'm making that statement. Robins will migrate early if worms and berries are hard to find. This is a prediction, again, I'm making from the explanation of it's now becoming difficult for them to phone in. When you're ready, now we can hit those into the chat. That's right. So that's saying, well, I'm assuming that these are their primary food sources, or these are what they're eating now, right? Cindy's pointing out, like, yeah, you're assuming that these are their only things that they're eating, right? Or that my ability to find and measure the amount of available worms and berries is in some way equivalent to that of the robins. And that I'm going to be able to detect fruits and foods the same way that they do. So these are all assumptions that I'm making around them. But around every prediction, there is a cloud of assumptions. So again, making predictions is useful. Making assumptions isn't bad. But what you want to do is try to be as aware of as many of the assumptions as you're making as you possibly can, and see if you think that those are reasonable. Because if it's not, you can be, you might end up spending a lot of time investigating a prediction that really isn't valid because one of your assumptions was off. So now let's talk a little bit about this idea of what if the same prediction can be made across all these different categories. Well, if that's the case, that prediction is really useless. It basically says, it's not going to tell you anything because it's true for everybody. So if you spend a lot of time investigating that, you haven't moved the ball down the field. But with some of these, let's see. Let's say I say, let's go over to leaves turn color here. And I say to myself, robin migration will be more synchronized when leaf color change is sudden and clear. Okay, you can see a lot of assumptions in there. If those assumptions are wrong, right, I can spend a lot of time researching, investigating this, and it's not going to get me anywhere. However, if those assumptions are right and valid, and I'm not saying they are, but let's say I went out there and I studied that and I found that that wasn't the case. I can say I expected to see this, but I didn't see it. I would expect that the robin migration would be correlated with some aspect of, like, if I'm expecting to see something and my expectations and my assumptions, I think that those are valid and I don't see those things. That makes it, I'm now really skeptical that that explanation is correct. So each one of these predictions is an investigation. So we're not answering the big global picture of why. What we're doing is we're getting at this by taking a small little nugget of some part of one prediction off of one explanation. And I'm going to look for evidence to see if that is borne out by what I see. And for some people, they say, like, well, my gosh, this is going to take too long. What is the quick way to do it? Well, there isn't one. That's why there's scientists working on hypotheses and different possible, plausible explanations in different ways in different labs all over the world. And sometimes they're doing the same project. And they're seeing, like, can you replicate what I'm getting here? And slowly by slowly, what we're able to do is to figure out, it's actually it's most useful when we're able to say, this hypothesis, if our assumptions are correct, it's not that. It's not that. It's not that. You know, if the pattern of data that I got looked like this, then I would say to myself, all right, my leaves turning color hypothesis, my days becoming shorter hypothesis, it's probably not those. Notice that I'm saying probably. And why is that? Write it into the chat. Why aren't I saying it's definitely not leaves turning color? It's definitely not the days becoming shorter. Give me in the chat. Why is that? Why am I using this tentative, sounds kind of wishy-washy language? Probably is more honest. That's right. Why is probably more honest? What's wrong with me saying, all right, I've proved that it's not these two things. Ah. Ray Bonto, I like your answer. Ray Bonto says everything, dude. Right? Yeah, because first of all, that would be assuming that all my assumptions are correct. And I don't know if all my assumptions are correct. It also could be, there's that category up there of something else that I haven't thought of yet. Right? You know, I don't know that my assumptions are correct. So I can't say for sure that those are wrong, but I'm saying that I'm now going to probably invest less energy in trying to figure those things out. I think my assumptions are correct. I could be proven wrong. And also, like, I only had a sample size of 5. So, but still, based on what I've done with my sample size of 5, not very good. All right, that's where I'm getting. And so at the end of the day, there will be a few hypotheses that as I am investigating them, the predictions that I make will be starting to be kind of borne out by my observations. If that doesn't happen, then I keep looking for another possible plausible explanation. And it might be that one of these is driving them. You know, for instance, it might be that they're related to each other. So for instance, it might be more difficult to find food because it's getting colder, right? That's again with this sort of more ultimate question slider, you know. But piece by piece, I get closer to understanding what's going on. And it's really helpful to me when I can actually find evidence against an explanation, because then I can say it's probably not that, it's probably not that, it's probably not that. So this is this is called the hypothetico-deductive method, right? So I am using deduction to kind of come up with my predictions off these hypotheses. And then I'm trying to find evidence against them. And it's a slow process, but it's a really useful process. If you're interested in doing a real deep dive into this kind of thinking, here is the paper that I suggest that folks pick up and read. You can find free versions of this online. It is one of the most influential articles in science. It's called Strong Inference. And it's about how do we manage this system of hypotheses and explanations from them. And that is extremely useful. The author is Platt. The author is Platt. So let's say for a moment that you have 10 possible explanations. You've tested them all On 9 of them, you found strong evidence against them. You think that your hypothesis, your assumptions are valid. On the remaining one, you test it and you test it and you test it, and it keeps coming up where your test supports your expectation. Like it's working. There's one that is working again and again and again. Is that, have you proved that explanation? Actually, I'm going to bounce back here, get all the way, there we go. So let's say there's one here, let's say it gets too cold. And every time I test hypotheses made off of this, it's coming up like, oh yeah, that one worked, that one worked, that one worked. Have I proved that that is the explanation for it? Now, the key word here is prove. Have I proved this? Give me your thoughts in the chat. I've taken all the other explanations and found strong evidence against them. Okay. Now going to put on a few celebrities who are going to weigh in on this, and then I'm going to ask the question again. Right? Right. So I see Capitol Heights and Susan and Ray Bonto have kind of weighed in on this. Kathleen's saying, not so much. Maybe we can't prove this. So let me just kind of, don't take it from me, right? Let's see what some of the experts have to say. Now, these are individuals that we cannot in any way disagree with, I'm sure. All right, you ready?
You will not follow my precept. How often have I said to you, once we've eliminated the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. An ancestor of mine maintained that if we eliminate the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth.
What exactly does that mean?
It means that if we cannot have fired those torpedoes, someone else did.
Watson, how often have I said to you, when you have eliminated the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth? Oh, very often. Very well then, it applies now.
If you eliminate the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth.
Once you've ruled out the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be true.
Ooh, mic drop there. So that was Spock, that was Sherlock Holmes, and perhaps Doctor Who there, saying that we've eliminated the impossible. Whatever remains must be the truth. Anybody want to change their I think everybody's saying like, nope, we haven't proved it. But like Spock was saying yes. What? You guys are going to go against Spock? All right, yeah, here's the deal. They're wrong because of those assumptions. If all of our assumptions are correct and we've eliminated all the other possibilities and we don't know what those are, but if we hypothetically could figure out what all the different possibilities are, sure. But we don't know that we've got a full list. We don't know that our assumptions are correct. Yeah, Ray Bonto is going to stand against Sherlock Holmes and Spock, and I'm with you, Ray Bonto. So we have to move forward with humility on this. So that's why scientists say things like the evidence supports the idea, or the evidence does not support the idea, or from my experiments, it appears that the evidence so far suggests, right? It sounds like they're being really, really wishy-washy, but what they're doing is they're being epistemologically honest in the face of the unknowns here. And so we want to kind of approach this with the humility of science when it's done right. And then what we're doing is we are coming up with our best explanation with the evidence that we currently have on hand. And we reserve the right to change our mind in the presence of evidence. So anytime we're dealing sort of in hypothetical land, if you have eliminated all the other possibilities, then whatever remains must be the truth. Yeah, but in the real world, anytime we human beings are not just sort of dealing with an idea on paper, but we must maintain that humility, realizing that we don't have all the facts, all the information. We have our own biases. We have our small sample size. We have we have a tendency to kind of like the first explanation that kind of comes out and dances with us, and we don't know all the possibilities, and our assumptions may be wrong. So back up here. So we've got these two systems. Let's see, and could it be? And the first allows us to directly observe. The second, when we can't directly observe, we can use inference. But there are times when neither observation nor inference can help us out. If I am wondering when the robins migrate, I can observe. If I wonder why, I can use this process of inference. If I'm wondering how the robin feels about the changing season, neither of these approaches will help. So there are times when I can't use observation and I can't use inference. And in those cases, there's a third category. We have let's see, we have could it be. The final category, dear friends, is let it be. Let it be. And that means from the perspective of science, we're neutral on it. We're agnostic. We cannot make a statement one way or another using science. So those are your three categories. Let's see, could it be, let it be. Let's just for a moment take a look at it another way, and then would love to open this up for a discussion and thoughts and sharing about how we go about as nature journalers investigating things. So you start with a question about a phenomenon. So these are some question about the physical natural world. All right. So questions about the metaphysical. This isn't the right toolkit. All right. But this is a question about a phenomenon. And so what we do then is we ask, can this be directly observed? And if it can, you observe it. The bias in the sample size are your bugbears, right? So you have to figure out, how is my thinking being affected by those? And then from all these observations you can make, you can kind of boil that down to some provisionary conclusions. And the degree to which you are going to, the strength of the statement that you can make is based on the strength of the evidence before you. And if evidence changes, you're going to change your mind. But you don't want to think of this as right or wrong. You want to think of kind of your confidence in something as being on a slider. The stronger you, the stronger the evidence, the stronger is going to be your support of an individual claim. But you can make a claim based on these direct observations. If it's an N of 1, be wary. But let's say that what you're looking at cannot be directly observed. Then we think, okay, can I come up with possible, plausible explanations for this? And if so, do any of those explanations, can I deduce testable predictions from them? So this is where deduction comes in this whole hypothetico-deductive method. This is the step where you're deducing. You're saying, if this is true, I would expect to see this and this and this and this and this. If any of those are things that you can observe, you're golden. Because then you go observe those things. That's the test. So you're creating the conditions for which you can create a test for this, for the explanation. How do you test the explanation? You make a prediction, and that prediction, if you are able to directly observe that, then that's your test. You want to consider those alternate assumptions, alternate explanations and assumptions, and here we can infer provisionary explanations based on the strength of the evidence for them. So again, my support of an individual explanation is going to be in proportion to the strength of the evidence for that claim. Again, the strength of my support for any explanation is in proportion to the strength of the evidence for that. That's my ideal, that's my goal, that's what I'm moving towards. It's hard to do this. It is hard to do this, but that's what we're trying to move towards. And finally, if you cannot make any explanations for the phenomenon, or none of those are able to produce testable predictions. Oh, this is just to say this category right up here, this is science land. This is the domain of science. Science operates within this box. Anything outside of observation and inference is outside of the realm of science. Science is an extremely useful tool, but it is specific to observation and inference. So if I'm outside of this box, I'm just not doing science. Things outside of this box are valid and useful, but they're just not science. So that is to say, if I can't directly observe, if I cannot come up with any possible explanations for this, or if the explanations that I come up with are not testable, then I'm outside of the realm of science. And for this, poetry, story, philosophy, spirituality, there are many other avenues of human endeavor. Music, song are wonderful ways of exploring these things. It's just that we're not doing science when we're doing those things. And that is a really useful framework. So when I roll upon a question, I can very quickly kind of go like, is this a let's see, a could it be, or a let it be? And once I know that, I know like, oh, it's a let it be question. Let's write a haiku. Right. And I'm now thinking 575, and I'm off and running. But I'm not going to spin my wheels trying to apply could it be to a let it be question. Because again, science can't give you any information if you cannot observe, if you cannot create testable predictions. And that is the structure of answering questions. So I am going to stop my share here, and I would love to open this up for discussion and love to hear your comments, thoughts, suggestions and ideas about how to do this and how we might apply this in our own nature journals. You can use the raise hand function and then we'll see you. You can also, if you can't find that on your computer, if you turn on your screen and you wave at us, we'll see that you've got something to share in the conversation. Does anybody have any thoughts, comments, or ideas? I'm going to bring in Ivea. Hey there.
Hey there, how are you?
I'm doing just great.
This was so much fun. Thank you for this. I love this. So a thought that I had about, I'm not sure, okay, I'm still trying to figure out whether this would be related to let's see, could it be, or both, but food for thought on that there might be more than one method to investigate in an inquiry. Does, like, I like thinking about it in terms of what do we have the means to do? Because you were mentioning about how sometimes we may not have access to certain tools. So then I like the idea that maybe there's some creative thinking involved to find other ways of investigating an answer when we don't have certain tools. So then it's important to be able to use our creativity. Also to note that with different methods, there might be different biases that are or aren't present. And so by doing that, sometimes maybe by investigating on different methods, maybe this method has this certain cloud of biases associated with it, and then maybe this one has a different one. But then by investigating it, then you're looking at them where the biases may not always be the same ones. I don't know. It just seems like it might be kind of fun to play with looking at different ways of investigating answers and then see what that does for us.
Yeah, I like that thought. And also there's nothing wrong with using a let it be approach to a let's see question. If you're out there and you're just looking at aspen trees and you want to write poetry, don't go like, oh no, I can't write poetry about this because it's not a, you can write poetry anytime you want. But we want to be aware of a big core of this is I want us to be just sort of aware of when we're doing science and when we're not doing science. And doing science is only one of many possible ways of interacting with the world and nature. It's a very useful tool, but it is one it's one tool in our human toolkit. But there's just been a lot of confusion about how and when to apply it. So this is, I'd say a big part of my thesis is like when we're going to use science, we just want to be really clear with that.
Yeah. And I would also add, I like what you said about how you don't have to force yourself to do certain things, but if it's useful to folks, I would also recommend writing down how you get answers or sketchnoting how you get answers, even if it's with icons or other things, because then you'll remember how you pursued an answer, so that way later on, if you're faced with a similar question and you're thinking, how am I going to address this? Then you can look back at previous methods you've used, or somebody else might come along and look and want to follow what you did. Or maybe you look back later and you're like, oh, I just had a thought about that thing that I did, that it's missing this entire other piece, but you may not know it unless you're reflecting on the methods that you use to find the answers.
That metacognition that you're describing, I think that the more that we can do that and apply that to all sorts of things, the better off we're going to be as a species. That's a real invitation to think about how we're thinking, but also but as we go into that, just be aware that your mind will deceive you.
Oh yeah.
We all, the kind of like a big default position for us human beings is to make a decision that is not based on, the decision we make is not based on evidence. It's often more based on feeling and perhaps the social structure that we're embedded in. And then that gives you the idea that I believe this. And then if you ask that person, why do you feel that? They'll cherry pick. I do this too. We all do this, right? We then cherry pick rational reasons to believe that.
Yep.
And it is, that's, critical thinking, it's really hard. And, just sort of understanding or taking a little class like this, it doesn't insulate us from making all those just very human, goofy decisions.
It's like when you're flying around and everything's great and you think that you're drifting on this breeze, and then you abruptly realize that you're not flying, and so you think you might be in a spider web, but then you realize you can move more easily, and you're surprised by this, and you're thinking, but I thought spider webs only functioned like this, and then you learn that it's not that way. But by the time you think that you're in a catcher's web, and you don't even understand it until the labyrinth or waiver is coming down and getting at you, and then you're like, well, darn it. And then you remember that you're a monarch, and then it may not want to eat you. And meanwhile, all of this is happening at lightning speed, and you're like, holy monkeys, now where do I get to write this down?
And are the toxic compounds in monarchs toxic to spiders or only birds? And you're thinking like, oh man, this still isn't good for me.
And
So yeah, what you're doing there is you are using poetry and metaphor to explore an idea, right? And that's just a great example of just another way of approaching a problem and thinking about something.
thank you.
Let's bring in Susan on this. And hey there, Susan, you can now unmute.
Hey there. This was so great. And Vea, that's so exciting because in your metaphor there, all of a sudden you have made me ask new questions. I had never even considered. Wait, do spiders are they actually affected by those same compounds? And would they actually recognize and or care about the fact that a monarch or something else has that coloration that shows that it's toxic? Does that actually work on spiders? I have no idea. I've never asked that before.
Or is my data that I think I know, but I want to double check about how they use their palps to sense the butterfly first and sort of take like almost a little sample. Is that true? Is that based on true info, or is it not? Like I've been told that they take a little taste test, I guess, of the butterfly, and then if it's a monarch, they cut it out of their web. But that might be wrong, or it could only be true in certain cases and not for all spiders.
Well, we could try.
And also, it wouldn't be interesting that just the idea that a compound that makes a bird sick would also make a spider sick.
Yeah, because I think
that's cool.
Another thing I have heard but have never tested before is the idea that things like hot peppers have a compound that mammals are affected by, but that birds aren't. This is what I have heard, and I have never tested it. But that therefore, for instance, so that a squirrel will eat that pepper or will avoid that pepper and not eat it, but a bird will eat that pepper and poop its seeds out miles away, thus giving the plant more ability to spread its seeds, theoretically, right? But also that therefore it would be a good idea to mix in chili powder with your bird seed so the squirrels won't eat it, but the birds won't mind. But I don't actually know if that actually works because I have not. Well, I don't have a bird.
You can buy capsicum laced suet to try to deter squirrels and rats.
Squirrels, I feel like that would be a very nasty surprise. But anyway, so I had so many thoughts. I'll try to keep it to sort of two things. One is I'm very interested in the discussion of bias. Because I think, I knew you were talking about the idea of trying to avoid bias, and we want to try to do what we can in our methods of collecting data to avoid bias. We cannot avoid bias entirely.
Yes.
It is very nearly impossible to do that. And so one of the really important parts of that scientific process then is to recognize when there is bias introduced by your methods, even if you don't know what the bias is, even if you know that your methods are something that has the potential to introduce bias, and to simply acknowledge that in your process. So in your nature journal, you could note those things, and then therefore to take whatever conclusions you might draw from that lightly, and recognize that those conclusions may reflect reality, or they may reflect something about the bias in your information, in your data, or a combination. And so just as just an example here, when I was, you've seen this was back in April when I was looking at my sumacs before they leafed out, and I was trying to figure out how many buds do you get? How many times do the buds go around the stem in a certain number of buds? And I don't want to go into all the details of that, but I had noticed that I looked at 2 different species of sumacs, and I found that I got quite different results. This one was very, very, very clustered. They were almost all the same, except for a couple of exceptions. And this other one was different. But I noted in here that for convenience, because I was not going to make a great deal of effort, just because I was, it takes a lot more work, I wasn't just testing a random sampling of all the sumacs in my area. I was testing every sumac I could reasonably get to close to the trail, along one area of trail. And those were spread out over a good distance, but they were along the trail. That was the blue ones. And then for the orange ones, I was testing all the sumacs that were in this one little bitty patch that were all close together, and they were so close together. I think it's quite possible that they were either clones of each other, because I believe that sumacs do that. So they may have all been connected under the ground, or they may have been basically the children of the initial one or something, and so all very closely related. And it's quite possible that being that closely related could potentially mean that they are more similar in that trait. So I don't know if they are actually that closely related. I don't know if that makes a difference. I don't know if the other sumacs that had more variation may have also been clones of each other or have been similarly closely related. But I noted that in my journal. I noted that was the case, and that therefore it's possible that close clustering may be a result of that bias, or that other biases may occur as a result of that. So, and I could have avoided that bias somewhat by going out and testing more sumacs in other areas, but there's a limit to how much you can do. So I note that in the bias, and note that in the journal. I think that's a good thing to do.
And that, I think that's a very kind of practical way to hold it and to think about it.
Mm-hmm.
That, and to know that this isn't perfect, and getting a truly random sample is extremely difficult. Botanists have all these little weird strategies of throwing quadrats over their shoulders and taking random numbers of steps out in fields and all these other sorts of crazy things. But to pay attention to how is this data collected. When people, when most lay people read a scientific study, they will read the press release for it. A little bit more sophisticated people will read the abstract of that article. More sophisticated people will read the methodology and the results instead of so some people will read, I guess I'd go from, there's the press release that is made by the university that you're part of, that is going to take whatever scientific research you did and try to sensationalize it so that you can get clicks for the university. Not a good source.
And so you get more grant money.
That's right. So there has to be an
explanation of why this might help cure cancer. Otherwise, you don't get grant money.
That's right. You're going to use the word cancer, and they're also going to try to refer to, if it's a technology thing, they will try to make some sort of analogy to something that people have seen in movies, such as Harry Potter's invisibility cloak or Spider Silk from Spider-Man. And no, it has nothing to do with that. So that's the press release from the person in charge of making press releases for the university. Then there's the abstract of your paper. Some people go to that, like, now I'm getting to the source. And then what some people will do is they'll read the abstract and then they'll read the discussion, right? So the abstract and then the discussion where the scientists are saying, like, this is why I think this is relevant, and here's sort of my thinking about it. The most sophisticated way to approach it is to look at what the methods are and the results are, and to derive your own discussion from that. But that's really
that's
hard to
why
do.
scientific papers have to include that information.
That's right. And now lots of some papers also require that you make the data set available online for other people to investigate. So not only you don't have to just take that person's statistics for granted, but hyper, you know, vigilant or skeptical folks will be able to reanalyze those statistics and sort of say, like, you know what? You didn't control for this when you're doing this, and when you kind of take that into account, your effect disappears.
Or they'll say, well, the statistics shows that there is an improvement, that by drinking, 5 gallons of raspberry juice a day, that you have an improvement in whatever, shows that. But if they don't report what the error bars are on that, so basically what's the amount of error, or what's the p-value of that is a way of,
and also what is the power as well.
Exactly. Well, then exactly. Folks, take a statistics 101 class if you haven't already, because you can get very deep into this, but with a little bit of statistics knowledge, you can interpret all of those things, and you will be able to instantly know what are all the things they're not saying in that press release, but that you can figure out.
Yeah, and also effect size is huge. Some things it might be statistically significant, but with a totally insignificant effect size. Right. And so all those are things that
it doesn't mean, wow, this is amazing, we should be so impressed. It just means we have a good reason to think that this didn't happen by random chance.
Yeah.
But the effect size might still be incredibly tiny.
Yeah. And all that, I mean, there are all these crazy things scientists have to do to try to not fool themselves with confirmation bias. All of these sort of elaborate loops of like double-blind placebo, like all this crazy stuff. It's just that human beings we're a sucker for a good story, and when we think we're kind of onto something, we tend to see the pattern that we want to see, and so all of these things they're techniques to kind of get us to not do that. And it is hard not to be a human, because bless us, we are. Let's bring in Avea on this. Hey there.
Can I I'm sorry, Avea, just before the ditches a sec, because there's one quick thing I want to say in relation to the double-blind placebo that mentioned there. Who wants to see that whole process from the inside as one of the points of data? Me. Guess who is signed up to participate in a vaccine trial for a Lyme disease vaccine clinical trial?
Congratulations.
Yes, and I will put information in the chat here in case anyone else is interested. I've signed up, and they gave like a sort of a preliminary phone call to check and make sure that you are qualified. But I intend to nature journal the whole thing. It's just so exciting. I do not like needles. But
so then you're going to go out in the field and roll around with ticks?
Yeah, basically. Now, actually, as far as I understand it, what they want you to do is just basically maintain your lifestyle as you normally do and take all the precautions you normally would do with ticks.
Okay.
But they do want people specifically who have a lifestyle that might bring them into contact with ticks, they say. So a lot of folks here could potentially get involved in that. And I believe that there are locations around the country where they're doing this. So, and the idea is, and so this, I have not been told the exact details of this yet, but my understanding is that this will be basically a double-blind, placebo-controlled trial. So they will be taking all the participants and randomly assigning them to one group or the other, the control group or the experimental group, which means that I might get injected with a vaccine, or I might get injected with a placebo, and I won't know.
And the person who's injecting you also doesn't know.
Exactly. Yeah. And
that's
then
really cool.
Presumably, and then it's over the course of 3 years. So presumably I will be seeing, and basically reporting, like whether I get Lyme disease or not. So, and yeah, so if folks want to look into this, someone's asking, what are the risks? I don't have all of those details yet, and there would still be an option for me to choose to drop out if I felt that they were, that I wasn't willing to take those risks. The vaccine has had some tests for safety. And so it has been determined scientifically that there's enough evidence of its safety to now go ahead and do this larger trial for efficacy to see if it's effective. And one possible outcome could be that the experimental group who gets the vaccine has slightly less incidence of Lyme. That could be statistically significant, but it's possible that, as you say, the effect size might be so tiny. It might be that both groups, some people get Lyme disease, but that the vaccine group gets just slightly less. So that effect size could be very small, in which case it wouldn't be worth actually distributing the vaccine. That's what this whole trial is all about, is to determine that. So I recommend folks, if they're interested, to check it out. So anyway, that's all I want to say on that.
Oh, that's cool. And I'm just going to add on to that. I've just put the link for the All of Us research program. This is National Institute for Health. They're trying to get sort of the largest database of human health conditions and cross-referencing that with genetics. And so they take blood from you. So if you ever wanted to do like the that spit in a tube thing and kind of get your DNA results and find out what % Neanderthal you are, but didn't want to pay for it, they do that for you, and they will give you they give you the full kind of all that sort of, what was it, not Free to Be You and Me, what is the I forget the name of some of these paid programs where you can get this information, but you can get all your genetic information and look at that, and also contribute to this scientific research. Yeah, 23andMe, not Free to Be You and Me. So if you want to join that research project, the more of us of all sorts of different parts of the country, different ages, different ethnicities, different lifestyles sign up for it, they want to have this incredibly massive database. And you get to find out how much of your genetic information you want to know. Like, some people don't want to know that they've got sort of a gene that codes for colon cancer, because that's going to freak them out every time they toot from that point forward. And if you don't want to get the genetic information, but you want to contribute to the project, you can also do that. And but I'm one of these people, like I want to see my genetic code for free, please. Yes. So I signed up for that. So I put the link for that in there. It's the All of Us research project. And that's really fun. But I hope that this vaccine is effective. Now this is like a phase 3 trial, right? Phase 1 is where they're trying to figure out, is it safe? Does it work? Is it safe? And I think phase 3 is when you kind of put that out to a whole bunch of people. So they've already figured out that that nobody's going to there's not going to be major adverse reactions from this.
Yeah, I believe that it is phase 3, but I don't remember. It says, and I will say, if folks are interested, you have lots and lots and lots of opportunities to get more information before you actually let them poke you. And I will say, I'm very scared of needles. I was brave, and I went and got my COVID shots, and I'm going to keep being brave and keep getting my boosters. And
I just got my booster
to protect.
brace.
Excellent. Yeah, so being able to protect myself and my community from an infectious disease is like just enough to overcome my aversion to needles. Being able to do science is definitely enough to do that. That's much more exciting. So for me, it's almost better that I might get a placebo because I'm doing science. So
that's right.
Yeah, it's That's great. So yeah, so folks should put it in. And Rabanto is asking what happens in phase 2, and I don't know because I don't know enough about these sorts of things. But maybe you know.
But I'm probably wrong. Somebody can check for me. I think that phase 1 is sort of figuring out are there any sort of adverse health consequences, and phase 2 is kind of fine-tuning dosages and things, and phase 3 is when you can put this out to a lot of people and kind of figure out the impact of it and its effectiveness. But not being in the field, that's just my layperson recollection of it, and I know enough to know that I don't know this stuff.
Well, and I intend to take notes on the whole experience. It's a whole 3-year process, so it should be interesting.
That's really fun. That's so cool.
My journal will include all that information.
Great to be. You are an awesome lab rat. That's really cool.
I look forward to it.
Yeah, embrace your inner lab rat. And
I'm sorry,
the whole like placebo effect thing is really, really interesting, and also widely misunderstood. Some people, like the lay understanding of placebo effect is that because I believe that something is making me better, there's sort of a mind over matter thing that is happening. And that's not what's going on with the placebo effect. So when what is that how we report our level of specifically of subjective things like pain. It is, people don't want to make the researcher feel bad, or they don't want to like come off as like a negative, I don't feel better person. Basically, everybody who's involved in any study, there's improvement in what they do. Have you heard of the Hawthorne effect? This is crazy town. So the Hawthorne effect was this study that they did in this giant factory in a town called Hawthorne, and they're trying to figure out like how can we maximize productivity among our workers. And so what they did is let's adjust the light levels. Okay, like this, and they adjusted the light levels like this, and productivity went up. I thought that was interesting. What if we adjust them like a little bit more? Yeah, productivity went up. And they said like, oh, what if we put this kind of ambient noise into the background? And they did. You know what happened? Productivity went up. And then they adjusted the temperature.
Are you more productive now than you were?
So against the control group, whatever they did, everything they did improved things. And so they
did they try lowering the light levels?
Yes, they did, and productivity went up.
All right.
And then they adjusted the temperature in the other direction, and productivity went up. And what they discovered is that there's a bunch of possible explanations for it, but the fact that people kind of felt that management kind of cared about things enough, like that they were paying attention enough that they're interested in the light levels. Like they changed people's like work schedules, and productivity went up, and then they changed them the other way, and productivity went up. And so just being studied, we do better. And when we're in a study, it doesn't matter what nonsense kind of medication we're getting, we have a subjective feeling that we're doing better, but it is not a objective finding. So for instance, kind of jumping back to placebos, when there's a very interesting study that was done with um, people who was, I think it was asthma. So where you can actually measure somebody's respiratory effort and effectiveness, right? So you give them the treatment and you've measured their respiratory effort before. You give them the treatment. You then measure the respiratory um, effort, and you ask them, does this feel better? And people would say, like, yeah, it feels a lot better. Yeah, I think that's working great. And then you look at their how they're actually breathing. They're not breathing any better. But they have the subjective feeling that this must be better because we want to be in the group that is getting the real medicine. We want it to work. We also don't want to come off as like a me. No, I don't feel better. I feel just the same and it's just not working for me. Like nobody wants to be that person. And so we trick ourselves and just think I feel better. So on subjective things like pain, anxiety, um, these sorts of things, there are these measurable subjective descriptors of how we're doing, but it actually doesn't translate into what is really going on in the person. So that's some people will say, well, if a medicine doesn't work and it's then you still get this sort of placebo effect, that's good, right? Like, no. It's not only is it dishonest and erodes trust in things that do work. It is it might people who take if you're taking essentially a magic remedy for something, you might defer actually, like let's say you take the magic remedy and you think that my respiratory effort is not just improved. You're now delaying going to definitive medical care for something that is a life-threatening condition. So same with if I am taking something to cure my cancer and it's not evidence-based, if that delays me in actually getting into a system that has evidence of working, it does real harm.
If there's this is a problem that comes up with doctors is folks who want to supplement their doctor prescribed medication or whatever things with other herbal remedies and things like that may or may not have any evidence for being effective. And in some cases they aren't. I mean, a lot of our medicines come from natural plants that we've then refined over the years. It's not as if those herbs and things are not necessarily effective. They may be, but people feel like, oh well, it's natural, I'm just taking this natural herbal supplement or whatever, and they won't mention it to their doctor. And the fact is that is actually a medication that is doing things to your body, and it might be interacting with other medications you're taking. And if your doctor or your pharmacist doesn't know that you're doing that, they might prescribe something that is safe and or effective on its own, but in combination with other things that you're taking could become dangerous or reduce the effectiveness of what you're taking. And that's a risk. So it's
the supplement industry is completely unregulated. It is completely unregulated. They don't even have to list the ingredients. And if they're putting plants in things, many drugs that we have that have known effects have we call these drugs, right? And people say like,
It
well,
still
I'm
is
just
wrong if
taking
you're taking
some,
liver bark instead of
it's just some
aspirin.
mulberry
Well, yeah.
leaf. It's natural. So just be like belladonna is natural. Botulinum toxin is natural.
Mhm.
So just because it's natural doesn't mean that it's going to be something that's good for you. And
Well,
yeah,
I was going to say it's like a popular one I think that I've heard is, like people are always worried about having toxins in their body they want to clean out, and there's very
Mhm.
good industry of telling you that there are toxins in your body that you need to fix by this treatment that only I can
Cleanse.
provide. People people will take activated charcoal for that, which is, as far as I understand, quite safe to take. It's not going to introduce any toxins, and it will in fact help neutralize stuff, including whatever other medications you're taking. And if you're
Yeah.
taking some medications that you really, really, really need, um, and you're also taking activated charcoal, then that could actually be reducing the effectiveness of the medications that you're taking. And so it's
Yeah.
it could be a
Yeah.
perfectly safe thing on its own, but it
Yeah.
again
Yeah.
can be
Basically,
harmed by that.
anything that says that it is going to free your body of toxins, that word is a major red flag.
Your liver and your kidneys are doing great at that.
Yeah. And
If they're not doing great, then you should be seeing a doctor.
if you're buying something to get rid of toxins, um, that is, yeah, your liver and kidneys. That's their job. But people will sell you all sorts of different. If I drink these juices, it's going to cleanse these toxins that are supposedly like clinging to the part of my digestive tract. It's a claim, and there's no evidence for it. And so how can they get away with this? Because they get away with it because they're not making a specific medical claim by using a general term like toxins and cleansing or supports your immune system. These general terms are actually their way of kind of getting around um, the FDA, so that they don't have to. But it's like figuring this stuff out. It's hard because their marketing makes things sound as if this is for real. And very often these products are sold on the same shelves with evidence-based medicine and science-based medicine.
Which, again, as we've said, you can't prove, that these proof is not really a word that works in science.
That's right.
So they,
Yeah.
they can rightfully say that those medicines have not been proved to be safe and effective, and they haven't been.
That's right.
But that's okay. We've gotten as close as we can reasonably get to determining that they are safe and effective. With certain exceptions, because everybody is different, with all those caveats. But
yeah, proofs.
I feel like I'm sorry that I jumped in with the Lyme disease thing, and when Yweb had something else that you were going to add, so I didn't want to forget that there was a.
This is fun too. Hey, by the way, anybody who's with us who wants to kind of get in on this, feel free to. Let's bounce over to Yweb. Yweb, what's on your mind?
So this is not quite relevant to what we're talking about right now.
That's okay.
But it was
we're now so far from our original topic. We're having a great time.
Okay, good. I'll say this quickly so we can get back to what we were just talking about. So you know how we have our Ywebs?
Yes.
You may come up with a new fun activity for what we could include in our nature journaling. What about if we create bias webs?
Oh, unpack this more for me. I love this idea. So tell me more about what you're thinking.
So the way that we have Ywebs to look at different possibilities of answers to an inquiry, we have bias webs to look at our potential biases that might be affecting our inquiry. And then the reason why I thought of that was because of also keeping in mind, like what Susan had said about there might be biases we're not taking into account. So you always include an extra question mark that says there might be more biases out there.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
And then that way.
No, I was going to say that includes, so you may say biases of like, well, I think that this might be biased to give me lower numbers than is accurate or whatever. I might be measuring this in a way. Yeah, you might have an idea of what direction that bias is going, but you would also want to include things that ways in which your whatever you're measuring or investigating is not representative of the whole, even if you don't know what biases that would represent. For example, all the things I've measured are all closely related to each other, so I don't know if there is, I don't know if they are more similar than the general population, even if I don't know in what ways they're similar. Yeah.
And by having the biases here, then you can begin to think, oh, well, perhaps that there's a bias over here, like, I don't know, confirmation bias or whatever. Then you can start writing down, oh, well, here are some of the ways that I can account for or even test for that bias if you're interested in really going deep into this. So then that way you start to think, okay, how can I test for the presence of that bias? What are some methods I could use for that? What are some ways, if this bias is something that seems to be more a feature than a bug, and it seems like it's going to be hard to extricate the bias from the actual inquiry itself, then you can think, okay, what are some ways that I can account for this bias? And so it's just another form of an idea web, except that in this case, you're expanding your thinking to try to be more self-aware of the biases. And because we're aware of the G.I. Joe fallacy, even though you might know these biases, doesn't necessarily mean that that's the end of it or even half of it. So that's why by having the possibilities here, then you can make more little webs out here about how do I address the bias? Because knowing it, it's like, okay, great, you know about it. What you going to do about it? How are you going to solve for that? Just for funsies. And then that way, hopefully the process of writing it down begins to get it more of a habit into your thoughts. So that then you're thinking about how I can address this, so that then you'll be more likely to act on addressing the biases instead of simply just knowing about them and then packing them nicely away.
I like this. I wonder if we should have do a class on cognitive biases and logical fallacies.
That sounds like fun. We might have to do a couple because there's so many of them.
Yeah, try to think of like what are ones that really kind of impact us as humans in our day-to-day stuff and also as nature journalers.
I might even have a few of that. I'm not going to go into much detail about this, but I was doing kind of an informal study recently that I'm not going to go into. And so what I've been doing is that now that I've been looking at my results, I wanted to consider if the study I was doing involved certain biases. And so I went to the Wikipedia and I, was making lists of, different kinds of biases that they say, and then, making stars next to them. And so I went on for quite a while and I was making stars about the ones that I wanted to come back to after reading short descriptions. I didn't even get through a quarter of the page yet. And then I began to find things like confirmation bias. And over here it says calls for greater self-examination, because I realized that I need to look at this, especially because confirmation bias is one of the biggest things you have to be ready for with science. So there's a bunch of different kinds of sub-biases within the one. So important to look at those. And then I got to egocentric bias. All of the biases that are probably relevant to us. And so that's sort of like, you want rabbit holes, that's a rabbit hole. And so, for example, the first one that's mentioned here under egocentric bias is bias blind spot. It's like, oh, I don't have any biases, or, oh, I have this bias, but I don't know about this bias. And so that's one of them. Another one's like false consensus effect, where we think that what we think is commonly shared belief and it's not. There's of course the Barnum statements that Jack talks about sometimes, where you're wondering, how did that psychic know that I had an issue with water when I was younger, that something weird happened with water? Or how do those horoscopes know so well that as a Capricorn this week I need to really be mindful of something kind somebody said to me sometime within the last 7 days? It's like everybody had these, well, most people, but it's a really good guess that these are applying to a lot of people, but they're just specific enough that you think it means only you. And so it's like, well then.
Or things like if you had someone who was really important to you whose name started with J when you were young, didn't you? Or I'm not sorry. If the phrasing is, you knew someone whose name started with J.
Hold on.
You didn't have someone whose name started with J, did you? That's the phrasing. That's the
phrasing. And then of course I have to
say no. I say, well, I see. I knew you didn't.
And see, I'm supplying you.
And hold on, I'm getting a J or an M name. A J or an M name.
Yeah, why is it always a J or an M name?
Well, now it's, well, in the present there is, and that name would be John Muir Laws.
Oh,
But the or that like superiority
Or
bias,
that one now.
me assuming that I must have more awareness of my bias than the general population, and therefore I have a huge head and everybody should look at my huge. No, no, I'm just like everybody else in all of the other things. I have just as many biases that I'm ignorant to,
Right.
or that I know about but that I dismiss because cognitive dissonance is a thing, or yeah, just I'm not as smart as I think I am. And I'm also not as dumb as I think I am either.
That's such a key thing, and I want to like reiterate that, is that the more that you have knowledge of what kinds of biases there are and are aware of them, to some extent, the more confident you feel that you are avoiding those biases, and then the more that you are subconsciously actually having those biases and making those logical fallacies because you're so confident that you're avoiding them. And I think, and I think this is true of things like, you know, people who are really strongly anti-racist and know a lot of the buzzwords and things about this, sometimes do, you know, things, you know, or hold views and things that can you know, are, you know, actually quite racist or harmful, um, and don't like being called out about it because they know that they're not racist. In fact, they do all the right things, you know. And you really have to like be aware, and then be aware of the fact that your awareness of biases can lead you to avoid seeing your own bias. It's like brain turns and ties into knots, but you really have to be careful.
It's sort of like if we were being decorator crabs. We attach this identity of not being a racist very firmly to our what we perceive we are. And if somebody questions that about us, then we're like, no, that you see where that lives right here. You see that lovely thing I put on my, that's me. I'm not racist. And then somebody else is like, can we pick at this decoration right here? What you think is seaweed is actually one of those like balloon strings that somebody let go of, and then it wound up in the ocean, and then you put it on your back thinking it was a pretty seaweed, but really it's, you know, plastic and not real. And you're like, God damn it. And then, sorry, pardon my language, you're like, oh goodness, I realized that I actually have this. But then you don't want to let go of it because it feels like it's part of you now. Things have begun growing over it. You know, it's become part of your body. There are lichen living on it that you're very fond of, or whatever's underwater, because I don't know this stuff, and I admit I don't know it. And so then that's the thing, is that we have these things that we become so attached to, but we're changing because that's what we do. It's what everything does except for vending machines. They don't provide any of change, but whatever's like, you have all of this that is so, you're so attached to, that when you realize that either your shell didn't grow in there or you've outgrown your shell, and yes, I know I'm mixing up all my metaphors, I don't really care, then the thing is that we resist.
Yeah.
Maybe that means it's good to shed your shell once in a while, and then
Well,
figure out which of those identities that you've attached to yourself are actually useful and good, and which ones aren't. And it's a good opportunity to kind of
or
start from a
occasionally,
clean state. I don't know if decorative crabs do that, but I would imagine they do.
or maybe pick up all of the decorations. I'm a decorated crab. Okay, then let's rip all of this off and see. This one, I don't want to rip it off. It feels really good. Is it going to actually cause my head to like really hurt and give me a headache if I rip this out? Let's try it. And then you kind of look at everything and you're like, does this, okay, what's here is still useful? This, I still kept this, really? It's rusting over. How did I not notice this? Oh, because it was on the back of my head and I can't see back there and nobody told me. Okay, then, well, either we can polish it up or we can go recycle it somewhere, preferably on land. And then you kind of redecorate, and maybe you've got some better stuff. And then maybe after time, the seaweed eventually goes bad, and then you have to replace that with some new seaweed.
And the things, the little pieces, the decorator crab. I like that decorator crab analogy. The pieces that I think are probably the most dangerous are the ones that really become core to our identity and who we see ourselves as, because if somebody kind of if we have to question that, it's really threatening to us. And um, we have a tendency to get really mad at whoever is suggesting that, instead of exploring the possibility.
Like, look at our
Going to
claws.
pinch you, the that there might be truth to that. It's and as you're suggesting, Susan, that all of this is just it's just part and parcel of being a human being, and knowing these things doesn't insulate us from it. We still make all these mistakes. Um, Perhaps being aware of it can make us more intentional sometimes. You know, when you really have the opportunity to sit down and sort of system to really kind of think it out. Um, but our kind of the anything that is really core to my identity, if that gets threatened, that is that's DEFCON 4. Yeah,
I just got a mental image. Sorry, I could make the excuse that this is what happens when I drink coffee, but I don't know if that's a real excuse or not. But I just got this mental image. You're inside of your own brain, examining yourself. You open up this one particular box and you're like Pandora. I do not care for the contents of this box. And you close it and you shuffle it away.
I like that. Yeah. And you mentioned the GI Joe fallacy, which I think kind of bears unpacking for people, because um, it's so rich in this regard. So when I was a little kid, there was this television show called GI Joe, and it was about um, people who were sort of part of a kind of secret government organization of heroes who would go out and do battle with villainous ne'er-do-wells called Cobra. And GI Joes would be constantly fighting Cobra, and they'd shoot each other with lasers of different colors. And so at the end of these shows, and they would have this little segment where they'd have kind of kids playing in an urban setting, and one of them starts to chase a ball out into the street or something like that, and a car is coming, and one of the GI Joes would step up and pull the kid out of harm's way and say, you shouldn't go running out into traffic and chase your ball, and the kid would go like, gosh, look, it's whatever the character's name was, like it's bat guy. I don't know the names of any of them, but they would sort of recognize it as like, oh, you're one of the GI Joes, and I should, therefore you've got standing, and gosh, I didn't know this, and so I shouldn't go play in traffic. And the GI Joe would say, don't play in traffic, and then the kid would go like, wow, and now I know. Right? And then the GI Joe would turn to the screen and say, and knowing is half the battle. And so the problem is that when you kind of learn some of these logical fallacies, you think that that's going to, like, oh, I've now studied confirmation bias, so I don't have it anymore. Right? Knowing's not half the battle. It's just that once you know about confirmation bias, you're still susceptible to it, and it's just knowing about these things it doesn't give you kind of a suit of armor. You still have to be really intentional about kind of reducing things that make it more likely to have the habit of going and playing in traffic.
Would you like to at some point brainstorm together about what would be a really fun way to make this into a workshop?
Let's play. Yes. Let's do that. I think we need to find some YouTube clips of GI Joe, amongst other things.
I have some ideas, and it has to do with wearing costumes. And you actually
I'm in.
You reminded me of something, actually. There's 2 events coming up that I forgot, and I remembered one of them because of Jack's awesome costume today. Today is October 20th. If I'm recalling correctly, 9 days will be a very special day. I believe we call it Bob Ross Day around these parts. and I'm remembering it because there's a certain video that I've been remiss on releasing of last year when Jack dressed up as Bob Ross on Bob Ross Day, and we did a very special workshop. And one of the things we do is we celebrate happy little trees, happy little accidents, and going out and doing some stewardship wherever we love nature.
That's right. Yeah, so that's right. The 29th is Bob Ross's, it's going to be Bob Ross's 80th birthday. And we should be ready for that. And that's really fun. Well, yeah, let's get something on our schedule to make that a fun thing. So it is about lunchtime here, and perhaps where you are, it's about dinner time. So I think I wanted, before we kind of wrap things up, I wanted to invite anybody who wanted to share something in the conversation to do so at this time. And Yweb.
First, I want to see though, if is anybody else who hasn't spoken want to go first? Because I know I've been talking a lot. Does anybody else want to go first? If not, then I have an idea that I might suggest for follow-up. It's something that I began working on this morning, but I've had in my brain for a long time. It's about this idea of questions, asking questions, and then coming back later on, and then following up by doing what Jack has said. I have to go back and begin to assign which questions I'm going to pursue, but I want to suggest a thing that I like to call question storm or curiosity storm. The way I create this is that I go through my journals. In this case, I went through my restoration diary, and I begin to look through all my questions and group them by categories. So in this case, it's my groups of questions about how I'm doing restoration at my site. In this particular case, it's any questions that are about a certain rare plant at my site. This is going to be about soil. I have to go back through and add some more. This one's going to be about my poison hemlock friends. This one's going to be about plants in general. This one will be about Cape Ivy. But I want to recommend that people do this. If we're talking about which questions need answers, then it helps to go back through and look back at your questions. And sometimes if there's a lot of them and they're really dispersed, look for patterns in them, especially because as you're looking through, you might find that you already have some of the answers without even remembering that you do, just by doing lots and lots of observations in the time in between now and the times that you first thought of those questions. So I want to recommend doing that as a follow-up, especially because then those inquiries get into your head even more. And if you've done this brainstorming about how might I find these answers, then unconsciously, you might even find yourself looking for them, even when your question's not foremost in your head. In a way, it's like priming yourself to find your answers, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I like this too. So to review, collect, and curate your own, the little shards of your curiosity that are displayed all over our journals, kind of to intentionally pull those together and look for a pattern. Look for a pattern. Look for a pattern. It's a great idea.
Thank you.
Well, friends, thank you for spending this time with us. I hope that you enjoyed the exploration of I Notice, I Wonder, not I Know Someone Who Reminds Me of Let's See, Could It Be, and Let It Be. And I had fun over the last several days sort of making that flow chart until I broke the flow chart software and couldn't get it to work for me anymore. Then had to, but it still got some things to work on that page there. I think it's a useful way of thinking about things, and I hope you enjoyed our discussion here this afternoon. Thank you so much for being with us, and Yweb, thank you so much for helping manage and moderate these sessions. It was great to see you.
Thank you, Jack, and thank you for creating the space for us.
Absolutely, I just look forward to seeing all you guys every week. Susan, thank you so much. I just let you folks know that kind of what happens when you kind of get like kind of a hardcore geeking out going. There have recently I was on a boat puzzling about the wake of the boat and what that meant about the curvature of the earth. So I had to call up Avea and um, drop my question on her. And so we ended up calling Susan and spending how many hours? 3 hours just doing this crazy rabbit hole, geography, mathematics, Pythagoras uh, dive in, and it was really, really, really fun. So gotta let you know that sometimes when you get curious about things, um, interesting things happen. It can build a community. It can build a community, and I want to encourage people to find people near you um, who you like rabbit hole spelunking with, and kind of nurture your own little communities of curiosity and investigation. It's so much fun to do this together. Thank you all, and we'll catch you again soon. Bye bye, my friends.
Take care, Inspector Jack.